Madam Speaker, assuming that we could feasibly transcend the barriers around resources and technology, a world with ubiquitous access to the digital world technology would be vastly preferable. We imagine this digital world would be designed and fluidly able to overcome physical restrictions. This means more space on the earth. This means infinite physical resources. This means no more lottery of birth. Your identity will be yours to choose. This is something we want everyone to have. This is the world we want to live in. On the affirmative, we have three main points. First being identity and lottery of birth. Second, avoiding conflict and war. And the third, reaching the good life. So first up, we have identity and lottery of birth, with two main points, constructing identity, and second, piercing minority discrimination. So, the birth lottery assigns you arbitrary characteristics as soon as you are born. It assigns your sex, your race, your appearance, age, etc. We think that these characteristics often don't align with your identity that is developed over time. An obvious example is gender dysphoria. It is a disjunct between the physical body that you inhabit and the identity of your real lived experience. We remove that disjunct. With a digital avatar, you could mold your body to perfectly fit your lived identity. Gender dysphoria could be solved instantly, as could disjunct of race, appearance, etc. Your lived experience would match your physical experience, which we think is very important considering the amount of people of trans, racial and transgender people who now exist. This then gives complete ownership over one's anatomy. Arbitrary birth lotteries no longer just benefit those who were lucky enough to be born with characteristics that match their identity. Therefore, everyone, not just the lucky, have synthesis of lived experience and physicality. Moreover, we think as people's identities change, their digital avatars would also change. If your gender or your race is fluid, your body reforms constantly to match that. Now to the secondly, how this moldable avatar affects minority discourse. We think that most people are inherently curious. They generally want to understand the lived experience of others, but when they can't, they generally make assumptions which leads to bigotry. For example, a middle-class white person doesn't understand the cultural impoverishment that affects many black people, which leads them to basically generalize all blacks as lazy, etc. We destroy this circuit. Instead, when that curiosity rears its head, that person can live as a black, female, trans, old person for a week or two and then go back to their own identity. Hence, they will be able to experience genuine lived experience of different minority groups and racial groups. We think that often, knowing the prejudices and harms faced by these groups will lead to a non-essentialized understanding of that group, hence prejudice will be greatly reduced. Now onto my second point about the reduction of war, with two sub-points being resources and incentives, and secondly, communication. In the material world, war and combat has had a disastrous effect on the people that inhabit it. The sheer amount of unnecessary murder, death, severe injury, severe disfigurement, and displaced persons and general destruction that has occurred throughout history up until the present day has both been severely lamented and grieved. In most cases, war is fought over resources and land, which in our reality is finite. Therefore, it is seen as a necessity to kill and be killed in order to essentially survive. Alternatively, in a digital world, we are not limited by these earthly trappings. Resources are infinite. Land is infinite. What is the point of war when what is being fought for can easily be replicated without any limit? We can basically go beyond the human imagination of what we want. Therefore, we believe the necessity of war is something bred out of finite necessity. Now onto my second sub-point. In a post-scarcity world, peace will be a far more achievable goal as communication across borders is also greatly improved, as we are technically not bound by the same physical limitations as we do in our current reality. Language can be automatically translated, and true understanding can be achieved through easier and exceptionally better communication. As a result, the conflict and struggles we once viewed as a necessary evil can be relegated to the past. Now on to my third and final point, reaching the good life. With my sub-points, how we avoid meaningless work, secondly, how we erode classism, and thirdly, how we enrich culture. Okay, so firstly, humans under the status quo are forced out of necessity to conduct completely meaningless work like scrubbing toilets or working in sweatshops. While of course that we recognise that individual preferences are nuanced and diverse, we feel in the vast majority of time the lottery of birth forces us to live lives devoid of true meaning and or purpose. In a world of infinite resources, we can choose the life and work that satisfies us. We think this means vastly more people will get to live the good life. They will be able to live happier lives and be able to basically live in an identity they feel is most likely theirs. Secondly, we also think that this starts to erode classism and sexism in workplaces. When there are no barriers for entry, the sorts of assumptions about the types of work certain people in society do start to fade away. Thirdly, we also think this means we will get far more cultural diversity as the artists and creators from smaller nations who previously had to farm to survive now can share and create. This enriches the human existence for everyone and the individuals as we break down these barriers which otherwise didn't allow us the chance to experience these otherwise unheard talents. These people who have had to live their lives unknown, whereas now they have a level playing field. Everyone can broadcast themselves. Everyone is able to be heard and give themselves to the world. So as a result, post-scarcity fixes a lot of problems that we currently have in our reality. It allows for the breaking down of barriers, the breaking down of limitations, and the breaking down of finite probability. This is why we in the affirmative are more than proud to propose.
Thank you, First Affirmative, for your speech. Can I have the first negative speaker to the floor? Jesse, right? Prefer Corinne, please.
About these tables and chairs that is inherently hard to get in and out of. Yeah. The thing that their case massively overlooked in this debate is when you change the way that people can construct themselves, that can construct the way that they experience things physically, is you massively change the way that humans interpret sensory experience. You change the way that people therefore construct values and value sets which are drawn from the ways that we experience the physical world. When you can remove all senses of pain, when you can remove your ability to feel things, when you can just have data uploaded into your mind in an instant, you change all of the ways that you experience the sensory world currently, and you remove the way and the bedrock upon which we have constructed all of our value sets. You make the world meaningless. Our stance in today's debate is that the human brain is something that is defined by sensory experience, the way we experience it now in the physical world. And it's upon that bedrock which we derive all of our value systems. When you allow people to change all of those physical characteristics, the logical conclusion is that the way we construct those value sets can no longer be done because we experience those sensory things in a completely different way. This is going to have a massive number of harms, and these are our three key points in today's debate, about how the value of human experience is tied to our current physical experience, about how limitations therefore are exceptionally valuable, and about how this necessarily leads to the sublimation of the individual, which is especially pernicious. Before I do that, I'm going to cover off a few quick key points of rebuttal. So their first idea on the identity and lottery of birth stuff, basically, their solution was for people just to erode all differences and become whomever they want to be. But we say that when you experience the digital world, and when we transition into the digital world, all that people are going to do is just opt into the majorities, right? They are going to leave the minorities behind. This is pretty disgusting for a number of reasons. The first of which is that we think in the physical world, right, we do have the ability, and we would much rather just affirm the value of those minorities. We would like to say that those minorities do have value, and we do want people to want to be them, and to construct their identities around them, and feel like that is an authentic experience that they derive a large amount of value from. We think we are tending towards that, and we would like to continue along that path. But secondly, what happens when people just go, well, being a minority is really freaking hard, let's just all be the majority, is you remove diversity from the world. And diversity is incredibly important because it leads to a distinct and discrete ways of experiencing the world, which tie together to create a far richer human experience. The conformity is what stagnates us and is what keeps destroys a lot of the richness from the world. We think we're second point, on this idea of war and conflict, which basically includes all of their stuff about farming and war and all of that thing. We basically say to this that their solution is just to remove all differences amongst those people physically. But we say the majority of those conflicts are done via vast ideological differences and the way that people construct what they believe in and religions and those sorts of things. We're going to think that those are the types of things that are going to be just as different and just as divergent amongst these worlds. We also think that people are going to have far more capacity and far more ease to engage in those wars and engage in those conflicts when they can create their own gigantic war avatars, right? We think also there's a tendency to conflict resolution. We're doing that, we want to continue along that path. So let's talk now about the value of human experience and why that's tied to physical experience. I've already told you that all forms of experience are subjective at base. They are tied to the way we experience sensory inputs. This is why, for example, we don't say that a person with severe mental illness is someone whose existence or experiences are less valuable than another. They are deeply personal to each individual, and because they are derived from the way we experience those sensory inputs. But when we change the way that people experience sensory inputs by the fact they can change every physical characteristic of themselves, they cannot feel pain, they cannot feel hunger, they cannot feel all of those things, you remove the bedrock from which we derive those sorts of values, because we have things like caring for the poor and wanting to house them because we can feel hunger and what that feels like, and we know that we don't want other people to experience it. We think that we have things like bodily autonomy that are drawn from the fact that life and the body is a place of sanctity that we don't want to diminish and we don't want to ever let go of. So all of our value sets, all these prioritizations of autonomy come from the fact of how we experience our physical world. In the cloud, this world in which we can change the way we experience them, our values dissolve. Our bounds of privacy and autonomy completely change. And the uncertainty about what replaces this is incredibly, incredibly scary. The fact is that when people go into this, it's incredibly irreversible and fundamentally changes the way we construct values. That is something that we simply cannot sanction. So, why then, this feeds into the idea of why limitations are exceptionally valuable in constructing value in our world. Because we said the reason that anything means anything is because we attained it. It's because we got there. We went through a process to get it, right? If someone just like handed me the Australs trophy now because I downloaded that thing, it wouldn't mean anything to me. It wouldn't give me any value, and that's the logical conclusion of what you can do in their world. It would be far more valuable when I have a kid or I get a job or I master an instrument because I have gone through the process. I have overcome all of the things that about my humanity that makes it hard to do all of those things, and I have attained that, right? I have been able to master the piano despite my like lumbering arms and the fact that I have a tone-deaf brain. It actually makes that exceptionally important to me and gives me that value. That's why that subjectivity of value is incredibly important. Those limitations make things valuable to us. Finally now, let's then talk about why the individual is sublimating. I think it's incredibly important because we say that we are, and how we imagine ourselves, is as the sum of our experiences. The feeling of being ourselves is as the sum of a discrete individual and the sum of all of our memories. It allows us to define a life narrative and a narrative arc. There's two ways that this is sublimated in their world. The first of which is agelessness. Because when you don't age, none of your actions contribute to a storybook, to contribute to a narrative that you are building all of the time. Your actions are essentially meaningless because they don't matter as to what's going to happen next, because you can just delete that, upload a new thing, and just say, I'm going to be a new avatar, I'm going to be really fit now, despite the fact that I haven't done any training in order to get there. And that means that when things are completely infinite, what I do in the instant doesn't mean anything. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, we say that when we can all just download different things and share those things with one another, what happens is my identity is just simply part of a greater, of a larger consciousness. My consciousness isn't discrete and isn't in and of itself as an individual, but it is just a subset of the data that exists and is available for everyone. All I am, therefore, is part of a large consciousness, but I am not a discrete individual. We think that's something that tears at the very foundations of humanity and tears at the way that I construct myself. It tears away from my ability to construct value and my ability to be my own individual. That is something that on this side of the house we cannot countenance.
Then report on heat.
Every time, Madam Chair, when we take drugs to change our health, every time technology allows us to undergo transgender surgery, we are using and transcending physical limitations in order to let people better construct their identities. Because the affirmative negative team was correct when they said this changes the way it allows us to construct our values, but what they were sorely lacking was the sorts of values which are created when you have physical limitations as opposed to the sorts of values which have when you don't. So first of all, on the basic things like pain and hunger, we never said we would remove those, but we would certainly allow people to experience or to opt out of it if that was their preference. Let's see what types of values the world where you were locked into what you were born creates. One, it makes massive essentialism of ethnic differences, of gender differences, of racial differences, of cultural differences, because it places unnecessary importance on the difference you are to someone else, even though no one ever opted in to those differences. In many cases, they were profoundly unjust. They were thrust upon you by the lottery of birth. Often they impacted your quality of life. They made your life short and miserable and one filled with discrimination. It also, when it came to resources, led to a far more cold, utilitarian view of the world, one where we started to prioritize resources over our humanity. They said that having finite resources helped us to help the poor. In our world, there would be no poor, ladies and gentlemen, because everyone would have the resources they need. And at some point in this debate, you had to prioritize people's individual preferences and quality of life over amorphous existential value in people being different. The value set which we created in our world was one where people valued different things, but they valued better things. Things which people wanted to be valued for, not what the world told them they should be valued for. To the extent which they said this was irreversible, we think literally the world shows this is not true. Every time we invent new surgeries and new procedures and new drugs which allow people to construct their reality better, shows that this world is fluid. Second question in this debate. Will people just opt in to all being the same? First of all, we think this is hugely offensive to just presume that everyone will opt in to being a white heterosexual male. I would put to you, Madam Chair, that these guys probably value being Kiwi, like you value being a female, and I value my mildly loose-related Maltese heritage because it brings value to me. We think that yes, there will be some people who undertake a utilitarian calculus and view that their quality of life will be better if they transition. But for those people, we think that is a choice they deserve to have. Because if it is true that their quality of life has been so harshly diminished by the fact that they are a person of colour, then they deserve the right to not be a person of colour if it improves their quality of life. But we think there are competing incentives here. Some people like their culture. Some people like the solidarity with the identity of their parents, with the identity of their peers. And we think that when it comes to making judgments on whether utility is more valuable than personal preference or whether culture is more valuable than utility, it is not the role of the negative team to make that choice for them. It is the individual's choice to make it for them, because the individual is best able to judge what is valuable to them, what will lead to their quality of life. Because what they missed out on is that the good life is different for different people, right? You can't just make broad brush assumptions about what people want and say that's what you're going to get, because your case doesn't really do that either, right? You said you should just be born in what do you get. In many cases, you will have to simply admit that your case fails that calculus as much as ours does. So we think that people will construct their identity in different ways which suit them. Third question in this debate. What did it do for conflict? We thought it was so glib of them to say conflict was dealt with ideologically. The reason which the ideological conflicts, like Islam for example, right, exist only in areas of extremely finite resources and extreme power vacuums, and not in the West, where you often have exactly the same belief divides, exactly the same cultural divides, is because there is more than one incentive at play here, right? There is not just the fact that you are ideologically different, there are things like language barriers, which mean that competing interpretations of the same text lead to divides. Our model, as you said, transcended all of those language barriers. There were also resources barriers, which said that when there was a world of finite resources, when you needed to find people to fight for you, when humans needed to band together to create a system where they could exclude others, often they arbitrarily grouped around ideological means. Just like they arbitrarily sometimes group around racial divides, like they sometimes arbitrarily group around national divides, i.e. American exceptionalism. What our world does is remove all the incentives for that grouping to exist. Because in a world where you are not competing with everyone else for resources, you are in a world where the world feeds everyone, you don't need to be exclusionary. You don't need to have those ideological differences, ladies and gentlemen. So we definitely won on the conflict point. Next question in this debate. Did limitations create value? We think that this was sometimes true and sometimes not true. We said that for very important things, for example, the Bible, it is not necessarily the limitation of the physical thing itself, right, which created its value. That's why we have had many iterations of the Bible, many copies of it, but everyone views it still as the Word of God. We think that there are some things like the Australs trophy, which perhaps we would, all decide is probably something there ought to be only one of. But in that case, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the world will mutually decide that that is the right thing, yeah? We think that for lots of cases, and also for lots of cases, we think that when it is a world of competing preferences, when you guys think one Australs trophy is great, and we only think that two Australs trophies is great, we will create the second one that doesn't detract from your value of the first, because you can personally say that mine was the real one or something, right? That mine is the more valuable one. That is something you can individually decide. In fact, if you don't like living in our proximity so much, the world gives you infinite space by which you can move New Zealand so far away from Australia that you don't have to tolerate our preferences if that's what you really want, right? The idea is that those limitations don't create value in a good way, they create value in a divisive way. And to the extent which they do distract the value a little bit, we give you infinite ways to mitigate that. But we would be more than happy for everyone to do things like play the piano perfectly, because we didn't think, ladies and gentlemen, again, this comes back to the value set. The culture you guys create is a culture of competition, where your ability defines your worth. What we think that does is it massively discriminates against people who don't have ability. It says perverse things about disabled people who will never be able to play the piano as good as Bach. And so therefore they are less valuable and their works are less valuable. That's the perverse value set you guys create under your side of the house. In a world where ability does not define worth, where beauty defines worth, where just the way in which the chords play to someone's individual preferences, that will define worth, ladies and gentlemen. We can transcend the world which says if you were born disabled, or you were born without the ability to do things, or if you were born with Down syndrome, then you are a worthless human. We pierce that veil by telling you that that is not what defines you, it is what you want it to be that defines you. And all of their material about a collective consciousness, we just didn't see how this wasn't contingent on everyone choosing the same thing, and we didn't think it was a realistic conception, or indeed like a significant harm to detract from no war, better construction of identity, and better happiness for everyone. We were more than happy to propose.
Thank you, second affirmative. And I have second negative to the floor. It is here before Pranaki.
And the speaker's point in this debate, and the point they, at different times in their case, seem to concede, is that we need moral arbitrariness. We need encumbrances. We need limitations on our world to base our values on. Because when they said that people have different conceptions of self-actualization or different conceptions of the good life, the question they never asked is where those different conceptions of self-actualization and where those different conceptions of the good life come from. They come from morally arbitrary factors that define the differences and experiences that people have, from which they construct value and from which they construct the narrative of their life. So within that context, there are three things that I'm going to talk about. Firstly, what are the ideological standpoints in this debate to clarify the principal positions that we're taking? Secondly, what effect do these standpoints have on the self-actualization of individuals? And thirdly, what effect do these two worlds have on things like conflict, on things like war, and the various ailments of the world as we see it? So firstly, in terms of the ideological standpoints in this debate, we agree. There are ills in the modern world. There are things like scarcity, there are things like poverty, and there are things like difference that lead to, the various ailments of contemporary life. The question in this debate is how we are meant to deal with these ailments and how we are meant to deal with these problems. We say that we want to work within the framework of this world, within the physical constraints of this world, with all the moral arbitrariness that comes with it, and use things like welfare, use things like international diplomacy, use things like aid to remedy the encumbrances that people have while keeping the moral fabric that comes from the physical encumbrances that we have. We told you that there is inherent value to having that framework in place and not stepping outside of it completely. The reason for that is that we base our values upon these arbitrary moral differences. We base our values upon the fact that we are encumbered in some way, and that overcoming that is something that is meaningful to us. And I'll deal more with this in self-actualization.
Their response to the elements of the world was basically perfect utopia, and they didn't want to go into too much detail as to what this utopia actually looked like. Their essential line was that nothing is fixed. We have absolute choice over everything within this utopic world, where everyone can choose any characteristic of any part of that world. They never wanted to talk about when different people's decisions about what that utopia ought to look like conflict with each other, and how their ability to manipulate the external world conflicts with each other, and how that would play out. But even if we accept that everyone's different conceptions of what the world should look like can coexist, and can magically be whatever they want them to be, we didn't think that was a real solution, because it negated all value that existed. Because to have value in peace, you have to have some conception of war. You have to have some conception of conflict. To value food on the table in the morning, you have to have some conception of hunger. You have to have some conception of the physical sensory inputs that make your life what it is, though they may be morally arbitrary. So let's move on to the second 2 points. Firstly, self-actualization. What they want to say here is that unchosen physical constraints are morally arbitrary, therefore we should remove all unchosen physical constraints. So they wanted to allow people to remove anything and everything about themselves. And we told you what that meant was people were likely to, try to not feel pain and trying to remove everything negative about their lives because, in the moment they didn't see those things as things they liked. The problem with that is that just because something is morally arbitrary doesn't mean we don't derive real meaning from it. Let's look at a couple of examples. We would never have children if we didn't value things that were morally arbitrary, right? We would never go through that process of having a particular child that is the fact that it arrived as morally arbitrary as compared to any other child, but we still derive meaning from that experience even though it's morally arbitrary. The second example here is that we wouldn't have things like nation states around which we derive a particular identity or a particular cut-off group of society, even though that division of land and that division of identity is arbitrary. We wouldn't have value in those groupings if things that were morally arbitrary never generated value. So we told you that those things did have some sort of differential value that came from their moral arbitrariness, and that was something that was important to consider in this debate. So the second thing to say then is that they conceded a lot of this. When they started talking about different conceptions of the good life, when they started talking about how different people from different communities wouldn't opt into the majority, wouldn't change to, be something that they weren't inherently before. The problem with that is that assumes a starting point of the real world transitioning into the digital world. But if we look at this as two parallel worlds, because if we want to examine the value of the digital world, we have to examine its value moving forward in the long term, not just at the point of change, right? So people may have incumbent characteristics now that they seek to optimize when they move into the digital world, but after that you get a complete flattening of any reasons for which people make decisions about what characteristics they want to prioritize, about what characteristics actually mean something to them, because those characteristics no longer come with historical experiences. Those characteristics no longer come with a particular set of experiences that give value to that person, or that generate the meaning that that person has given to them in a particular context. So that's why people who had African and Americans in America who had slave owners as grandparents take particular revelry in reclamations of things like the N-word, take particular revelry in the listening of people like Kendrick Lamar or Tupac, because of the fact that those choices that they now make are with reference to things that have happened in their history that were morally arbitrary, that were wrong, but now give them a great deal of value in retributing for them in the real physical framework of the world that we think people should work within. That's where the value in this debate stands. The third thing that we brought to you under self-actualization was the idea of individualism, because we told you individualism comes from the fact that in the physical world you think of yourself as a discrete, independent person. And that comes from the fact that the constraints of your physical body are determined. There is no way for you to change the dimensions and the extrinsic limits of your physical body, at least at the latter bounds. The response to this was that we take drugs, we do a bunch of other stuff, we eat food, and various things that alter, I suppose, the internal chemical composition of our bodies. That is true to an extent, but there is still an outer limit at which we cannot change, right? We cannot change the fact that our mind is physically instantiated into the
various regions of our body, right? But when you are in a digital world, you open up the capacity for people to change a lot of these things. You open up the capacity for people to change the way in which their consciousness is instantiated into physical things. We think what that leads to is a trend towards things like a cloud consciousness mentality, and that is a world in which you subsume individualism and you subsume relationships between individuals that are really important to that same narrative that we told you was important to the way people live their lives. Lastly, in terms of conflict, and this doesn't really need much time, because as I flagged in my introduction, all they wanted to tell you about in terms of conflict, in terms of poverty, in terms of war, was saying that these are problems in the world and we're not going to have them in our utopia. But the problem is that things like peace, things like diplomatic stability are only valuable relative to the struggles that we've just faced. Because if we've never faced, like over the course of an eternity by the sounds of it, if you've never faced any struggle, peace is absolutely meaningless because you can't imbue that peace with any value whatsoever. So we're happy to see some conflict in the world, and we think we're getting to a stage that we're getting quite good at diplomacy, we're getting quite good at politics, that we can minimize the really heinous types of political events and keep them to, some level of parity. But we think it's good to have those small bursts every now and then because they remind us of our humanity, they collectivize us, and they give us a whole range of reasons to continue living. In this debate, we were the team that gave you a narrative as to why people want to continue to live their lives, and that's what we should stand for.
Thank you, second negative for your speech. Can I have the third over to the floor, Nishant, preferred pronunciation?
Madam Speaker, you're probably a much better student than I was, so I'm not sure if this analogy will have any relevance whatsoever. But when I was a kid, I used to play a game called Warcraft 3, right? And in this game, there is a cheat that effectively gives you unlimited money. And you can keep doing that and keep giving yourself unlimited money, except the issue is even when you have the complete capacity to do that, after a while, the game just gets really boring, right? Why is that? Because we actually like limitations. We like having them there. We like having to overcome something. The difference is, in our world, people get to choose what limitations they impose. They get to choose whether or not they want to program learning the piano into their brain, or whether or not they want to visualize their piano in front of them, and then slowly spend the next 10 years of their life becoming the next Chopin